start recording so that I don't forget to do that. Okay, hi everybody. Welcome so much to WGSS 101. For those of you for whom I'm not your professor, I'm Dr. Emily Mitchell-Eaton, and my co-instructor, Professor Allison Case, is also with us. Professor Case, maybe you can give a wave. Yep. And we also have students calling in from the 11:45 class and the evening class. So thanks to all of you for joining us today. Before we get started, let me give a couple of quick reminders. First of all, I think most of you have done this, but if you haven't, please just silence your mic, turn off your mic during the talk. What we'll do is I will turn this over after an introduction to Dr. Gieseking, who will talk for about 30-ish minutes, and then we will open it up for discussion and Q&A, which I think will be really lively. And at that point, you can, I'll ask you to raise your hands and I'll facilitate the Q&A and I'll call on you. So the lecture will be recorded and posted in Glow right after class. I think that's it. So just as I mentioned for the Q&A, just be ready to ask some questions, take some notes. I think we're in for a really rich presentation and you'll have a lot to discuss, but be ready to have a couple of points you wanna ask Dr. Gieseking. Okay, so everyone can hear me okay? Good, wonderful, just a last double check. Okay, so let me, without further ado, introduce Dr. Jack Gieseking. Our speaker today is an urban cultural geographer, feminist and queer theorist, and environmental psychologist. Dr. Gieseking is an assistant professor of geography at the University of Kentucky, where he teaches courses on digital, feminist, and queer geographies and critical cartography and mapping. Dr. Gieseking's first book, A Queer New York, Geographies of Lesbians, Dykes, and Queers from 1983 to 2008, which just came out from New York University Press, congratulations, is a historical geography of contemporary lesbian queer society and economies in New York City. And this is a project, this is really a project to keep your eyes out for. I'm just very excited to read the full copy of this manuscript, and I'm sure many of you will enjoy it as well. Dr. Gieseking is also co-edited the People, Place, and Space Reader from Routledge, is the managing editor of ACME, International Journal of Critical Geography, and just sort of an incredibly well-rounded scholar who's published in an incredibly diverse range of topics and areas, and has really pushed our field of feminist and queer geography in so many exciting ways, and is also a longtime friend of mine. So, with that, I think I'll turn it over to Dr. Gieseking for today's talk, Data Visualizations on Behalf of Recognition, How Trans Activism Made Way for the Queer World of Trans Tumblr.
Well, Emily, thank you very, very, very much. You don't have to see my personal meeting ID. That was really generous and lovely of you. I'm really excited to be here, hanging out with all of you. Here, let's get to the beginning of this. So just to add some background, my pronouns are they and he. And I am trans, and I started working on this project actually. Oh, it does this thing where it's going to make me look at myself the whole time. So just excuse me, I'm going to delete that so I don't have to see myself through my whole presentation. I'll talk about how I came to this project and why I got interested and excited about it. I think Emily already said the title, or Dr. Mitchell-Eaton, your professor. So something I've been reading about a lot more is trans activism, because for a long time I've been thinking about trans Tumblr. So if you aren't familiar with this image, you have not gone back into history and enjoyed the L Word, which I highly encourage you to do. It is a really trashy lesbian and a bit trans soap opera set in LA. It was the first international lesbian TV show ever. And this is the R chart, the network of all the hookups and relationships and one night stands that one of the characters puts together. And she says, it's going very, there we go. And she says that one of the characters Dana says, wow, it's so big, it's so crazy. And Alice, who creates it, says, yes, it's crazy, but not tiny. And it's important to think about all the kind of like ways of queer world making that we don't usually see or record, and what data needs to be private and how data is private. And this was like a cause for gossip and fascination about who was all related back to Shane on the show, but how does this relate in broader ways? And so these are the questions I was thinking about when I came upon trans Tumblr a decade ago. So what can we learn from trans youth on Tumblr? And you're like, Tumblr, isn't that over? We'll talk about that, don't worry. What interventions, insights can trans digital data analysis offer? So I should also say that I love making data visualizations. So I'll show you some social network analyses, some text analysis. I do a lot of mapping, graphing, and I teach a class where students do all of those at once to think across these different kind of platforms and what can we learn from trans data to see the world differently. I'm also really interested in like, what is trans? I have no idea what's happening with my computer today. I'm sorry, everybody. I'm hitting the buttons very slowly. There it goes. Okay. What is a trans theoretical intervention on behalf of trans Tumblr? Okay, we're just going to do this, the reveal. Yeah, what's the trans theoretical intervention on behalf of trans Tumblr in the era of big data? And what interventions, insights can trans data afford theorizations of spatial justice? So why is that even important? Well, if we keep thinking about data, big data, we're in this huge moment. There it goes, I fixed it. If we keep thinking about big data from our perspective of who has the most data and who has the most power, and we assume that bigness equals power, a group of people who are very much against binaries has a lot to say about how power works. So the interventions I want to make here is one is to thinking about trans youth making identities as a global virtual identity. I think trans identities have been globally formed and shaped in a surprising way for decades now, and we'll talk about that as part of trans activism. I want to think about how trans people intervene in urban digital theories about how we make space, and I mean like how we design it, how we live it, how we conceptualize it, how we imagine it, and how it should be done differently. Everything from bathrooms to dorms to public spaces to airports in our everyday experience. And then also interrogate how digital platforms are specific to their moment when it comes to activism, right? What role did trans Tumblr play? And trans Tumblr was something that kind of happened around 2007 when Tumblr launches for about just over a decade until NSFW passed the Not Safe for Work law very recently. So when we want to talk about trans activism first, if you don't know anything about trans history, let me first start by recommending the Digital Transgender Archive, which I think at this point has hundreds of thousands of resources. It takes materials from already existing archives all over the world and brings them together. It also works really most closely with the Transgender Archive at the University of Victoria, which is the largest amount of transgender materials. And if you're interested in doing any sort of research or a project, this is, and due to COVID, this is one of the coolest resources possible. It goes on for some time, but as you can see, it goes back quite far in time to the 19th century to the 18th century, and even earlier than that. There's a button collection. I mean, it just keeps giving. But what we're going to talk about today, actually, I want to start thinking about trans activism in the 90s, right? So how does that happen? What's happening then? Well, one thing that happens is the Transgender Usenet archive has pointed out, and this is a work from Avery Dame Griff, who's a trans digital theorist, and they collected all of the Usenet posts. So if you've never seen Usenet, this is what it looks like. So before there was an internet where you could click on little icons and images, there was just a thing called Hyperterminal where we checked our email. So in the 90s, when I went to college, I actually had access to this. And anything you ever wanted to read about or talk about, there was a group about it. And it started in the late 80s. It was something that Stanford created when they created the first emails, and which were actually created by a trans woman, but that's someone else's research. Cass Adair, we can talk about that too in the Q&A if you want. But when they were creating this, they were like, oh, let's let's make a way for conversation, just like the nerds hanging out at Stanford, creating this part of the internet and email. And they created all these different groups. So one of the groups that they created was a trans group. There was a trans group that people started talking to one another. And Avery Dane Griff has gone back and collected all of this data and actually found the first use of the word cisgender in this archive, which is really amazing. If you're unfamiliar with the word cisgender, it means someone who identifies with the gender and sex assigned to them in birth. So there's transgender and cisgender. If you also don't know, the word transgender is usually defined as someone who doesn't identify the gender or sex assigned to them at birth. Non-binary means someone who doesn't believe in either of these identities or doesn't feel that they fit within these identities, the binary of male, female. And there's also gender non-conforming, which could be someone who is trans or non-binary, but maybe doesn't identify as both, or someone could be all of these things at once. So when it comes to the word cisgender, tracing this back to the 1990s is pretty striking. People think of it as a new conceptualization of a new term. And these are some of the images that Avery created. So Avery's website was down this morning and I emailed them. Oh, they were not able to get it back up, but I emailed them to tell them. So I can tell you what this graph is doing. It's more fun to click on it. So every time that someone used cisgender, the brighter the color, these like red, orange dots, each dot is a person making a post to Usenet. So it's just kind of, imagine like Reddit is today, you post something and someone else responds. And every time that a thread started using the term, there's kind of like a couple of clusters. And what Avery was able to do was to like look at patterns in the conversation to figure out, when did this word go viral? When did other people start using the term cisgender? And so in the 1990s, there's a lot of trans activism happening, in part because of an amazing historian named Susan Stryker, who is a trans woman who decides to come out during grad school, and she starts looking through lesbian and gay archives and finds all these trans materials in the 80s and 90s and realizes that no one's recording this or talking about this. And at the same time, because of the internet, because of more people being able to talk about who they are and how they feel about themselves, or being able to look online, you have to be pretty technical to play around with this, right? It's before, AOL is about to start, but people are finding one another, right? And the more that people find one another, they're like, oh, that makes sense. That's who I am, right? That's, oh, wow, I didn't even know that existed. I didn't know that was an option. I thought these people were, words used for trans people were, freaks or deviants, associated with pedophilia. So this kind of moment is really shifting people's ideas by saying, oh, I feel like this as well, and I'm human. And there's a lot of recognition that grows with that. So from there, in the 2000s, in the United States, one of the kind of big events that it started in the 1990s, but really in the 2000s, the numbers increased drastically, is there was a group called the Michigan Women's Folk Festival. That was quite just where you would find like the Indigo Girls, it was a very acoustic, women loving women space. And in the 1990s, some trans women came to Mitch Fest, as it was known, and the people who were letting them in asked to see their genitals to prove that they were really women. Now, this hadn't happened to any trans man or any woman with a beard or facial hair, or not having breasts, and yet trans women were treated in this way. And across the street, which was, I should say across the field, across the road, a massive group creates Camp Trans. You might have heard of the book Stone Butch Blues, and Leslie Feinberg, who's an amazing, famous, and very important labor and trans activist and historian, and they are second from the left here. also what happens in the 2000s that's pretty awesome, maybe or maybe not, is we all start to get iPhones. And when we get iPhones, we can see images, right? Remember I think you're young enough to remember flip phones, but suddenly you can carry all these images and you can privately, secretly, without being on your parents' Wi-Fi internet history, start looking at images. And social media happens, right? There's Facebook starts in the mid 2000s. If you didn't know, this is when this all erupts. And Tumblr starts in 2007. And each of these platforms offers something different, right? Like, why do you go to Instagram versus TikTok versus Snapchat? Like, there's different vibes there. It also has different functionality and it works in different ways. So we think about Facebook, which your parents could have gotten on even then, and some of them were starting to do. Tumblr was a space that was very, punk, zine, comic, nerd, goth oriented. And it was also kind of like where people who felt like they were outsiders could paste images that they like. It was a photo blog sharing site where then you could add text and then eventually you could add video. The 2010s went to a different level though. So the kind of understanding of transgender life or identity you might have now is so wildly different than what's come before. And in 2014, this article on the left came out in Time, and it's often referred to really mark the transgender tipping point. Laverne Cox being one of the most famous and widely recognized trans actors still today for her work in Orange is the New Black. And then you can think about how social media shifts. Tumblr has disappeared with NSFW. I'll talk about that in a little bit more in a little bit later. But we can look anywhere and everywhere, and now trans people are models for Dolce & Gabbana. And now trans people have run for office publicly and are visibly out as transgender people. There have been a lot of trans people in history that we don't know if they're trans. They don't want us to know that they're trans. They don't want to, or intersex. They don't want to talk about it. Intersex meaning that you're born with chromosomal markers and or genitalia of both sexes, genders. And so in the 2010s, things have shifted drastically. At the same time, there's this huge surge in the number of bathroom bills that the right is pushing to still maintain and mark trans people as deviant, like to recall these kind of like fear-mongering techniques. To the Health and Human Services has been told they cannot carry this out, but they tried to pass a law that they didn't, that Health and Human Services actually didn't have to offer medical care to any transgender person. This was a few months ago. There was the move very on in the Trump administration to push trans veterans out of receiving any support, and then to not allow trans people to serve in the military. So it's this huge kind of like whiplash moment where so many things are moving ahead and so much is being pushed back upon. And this kind of backlash is something that I don't know if you've heard about Susan Faludi, but she wrote this awesome, great book in 1990s feminism called Backlash. And as soon as somebody moves ahead with a movement, there's always a pushback. Also, before going on, I want to point out the word trans recognition and think about how recognition works. If you've heard the word passing, like this person, a trans person is passing as whatever gender, actually the word is people are using now as recognition, right? They're being recognized by other people because their gender is always relational, right? Somebody's always recognizing you as another gender. And in fact, one of the first things we recognize about someone is their gender, and with it, we project all of our assumptions or ideas about that gender with one another. Okay, so this is a little background about what's happening. Trans activism continues to grow in many ways. And in the 2010s, I should also tell you that I am 10 years younger, and I'm writing this whole book about lesbians and queers, and I'm also doing research in Berlin. And I decide I'm gonna go find my new name, because my birth name doesn't feel right anymore, and I'm gonna get this. I'm gonna like do something different. I'm looking for my new name. And so here it all goes together. There we go. Also working on the new name. Keep going, Jack. And I find this. I look up trans name, and I think I use a hashtag. And I found all these, I don't know if you can tell, I've blurred out their faces, but they're all really, really young. They're all your age or younger. Sorry, the birds of Western Massachusetts send their best over the Berkshires to all of you, wherever you may be. And this is the kind of images that people are posting. There's a lot of selfies. There's a lot of pro-trans imagery. And there's stories, if you can see underneath all of these, there's hashtags and stories that go with all of these images that people are sharing. And I'm really shocked. And so as I'm looking at trans Tumblr, go away, Crow, go away. Is it bothering, Dr. Case, is it bothering you? The crow? No? No, you're okay?
You hear me, Jack? You're doing great.
Great, thanks. Okay, cool. It's just me. Okay, groovy. So I start to look at M to F and F to M Tumblr. So what are these terms? So back 10 years ago, it was much more common to say that you were M to F or F to M, male to female, or female to male. These are terms that have fallen out of use in conversation, but they're still very popular hashtags for people to find one another, especially when they're sharing medical information, right? And so the first thing I noticed about all these posts when I say suicide is I would guess that every 50 to 100 posts that I was scrolling through in the middle of the night in Berlin was a suicide note. And I was just overwhelmed. I was already in my 30s and I was like, oh my God, these kids, how can I help them? And if you click through, you would see that someone already had helped them. So for every note that someone would post saying that they were thinking of killing themselves, there would be 50 to 200 responses. I'm here, you can call me. I'm not going anywhere, I'm gonna DM you. You're not alone, this is happening to me. And I was just struck and shocked by how much community and how much connection there was happening in this platform and how many people were supporting one another. The other thing that stuck out and why people were using M to F and F to M hashtags is because they're sharing medical knowledge, right? And so if you're male to female or female to male using these now very awkward terms, this is a very different sort of medical knowledge, right? What happens to your body on testosterone versus estrogen? Having facial reconstruction surgery as a trans woman is very different than having top surgery, a double mastectomy, and plastic surgery to build pectoral muscles for a trans man, right? So we start to have these different conversations and threads about what's also happening. The other thing to think about is the kind of, when you think about becoming, someone becoming a man or recognized as a man, becoming recognized as a woman. I was also looking at YouTube videos. And this is where, if you look at these images, you can't really see what anyone's race is in these images, but it struck me very clearly that a lot of these people would pass as white. And I was wondering about trans people of color and their experiences. So I started looking at YouTube, and I watched a set of like very powerful videos that still stay with me today. And the first one was a trans woman, so someone who was assigned male at birth, who talked about walking, how people would always, walk on the other side of the street if they saw them, how people were afraid of them, people would call the cops on them. And now when they went to a bus stop, people would stand overly close to them now that they were recognized as a woman, that people would hypersexualize them and try to touch them and felt that they had access to their bodies. Conversely, when I watched some videos about a trans man, someone assigned female at birth, they were in the tech industry, and this was a young white man, trans man, and he was saying that he had switched companies. He hadn't really, after he started to be recognized more as male, and he was on a conference call, and he went to say something, and everybody stopped and listened to him, and it just seemed like, wow, that was really weird. Everyone just kind of listened to me. It must be this new company. And then he noticed that the one woman on the call would say something, and another cisgender guy would repeat what she said and take her idea. And then when the trans guy called this out, all the guys gave him a lot of crap, like, what are you talking about? She didn't say that. And they were just ignoring the one woman on the call. And the trans guy realized that he was being treated now as a masculine male person, and how he was then have been treated in the past as a woman, right? And this also has a lot to do with race, but something I cannot as much study, and I'll happy to talk about this later, is race. And we'll talk about that and why. So another thing that's happening, and there are definitely people of color posting here, right? I'm absolutely sure of it, but what they do is they talk in the comments, right? And they write textual posts, and they're less likely to post pictures. And when I talk to trans people of color about why they don't post, they said because they open it and it looks like a bunch of white people. So they don't feel comfortable posting images of themselves there. Or if they have, they get a lot more critical comments and don't feel that support. So they post without images, right? So there are contributions here very unevenly again, infused with racism and injustice and inequality and class and ableism and norms around who is trans enough. But there is also a production of culture. Like as people keep sharing images of what a trans person looks like, right? As people keep tagging themselves in these ways, there's different dialogues and terms being thrown away. There's language being formed, right? And people are telling one another when you are trans, like what does it mean to be recognized as trans? What does it mean to be recognized as the other gender? There's a lot of like high school behavior where it's like, oh, you're not trans enough. So there's a lot of mean stuff. There's a lot of support too. And so as a geographer, I was also really interested in, where did they live? Where did they hang out? And because it was Tumblr, it wasn't like Instagram where you would mark your posts and any sort of locations. But what did stick out to me is they had these amazingly gigantic social networks, because everyone who likes someone else creates a connection between them, or people who follow one another. These become your networks, right? And the other thing that stood out to me was something that was happening with visual software, visual recognition software. So if you don't know, visual recognition software doesn't work very well. It's pretty awful. You can read lots of articles about that. But they still use it to do a lot of policing and criminalization. And it's even with its limited capabilities, there's an assumption that computers and tech can do everything. But I had known that there were a few studies that had come out for the male and female recognition package. And this was a piece of software that has been going on for a really long time. Like as long as they've had visual recognition software, this has been a baseline test. Can the computer look at the picture and see if this is a man or a woman? So just take 1 second and think to yourself, which pictures of people they're going to pick to figure out if they're men or women. You guessed trans people. You're totally right today. Yes, they were taking pictures of trans people from the internet, and that means that the coders themselves would have to mark the trans person as male or female. So the coder is deciding, right? And most coders are white and male overwhelmingly, and cisgender and heterosexual as far as data indicates, are deciding who is what gender, right? And then they're teaching the algorithm to work in that way, and they're encoding people into different software in that. And that's something I really wanted to respond to, thinking about all these images that trans youth are sharing about themselves publicly. All of this is a public search. You can look right now and find so many images of people sharing images of themselves and not realizing that the images have been used unfairly. So what have I been doing? So I had these hashtags in mind, and I've picked about another 12 hashtags I will not bore you with. I was actually teaching at Bowdoin, and I worked with this dope undergraduate. So if this is something, if you know how to code in Python, you should tell faculty, hey, I know how to do this. And actually, this student got credit and wrote the script in a semester and learned a lot about trans studies, something she otherwise wouldn't know about, but influenced her PhD. She's super cool. We still keep in touch. And at this point, it's actually over 6 years of data, and I can grab 20 posts per hour of each hashtag that I have. And so I have over 1.5 million posts, and this adds up to 150 megabytes of data. And I've written about how limited that size is as data, but 150 megabytes is, it's something that you can attach to a Google email in a matter of seconds. 150 megabytes is smaller than the smallest, like the tiniest, oldest USB stick that your parents have in the back of a desk or in the bottom of a bag is actually, it's still like twice the size of that, right? So I have 6 years of data, 6 years of data, and it's teeny tiny, right? Because it's just text files, and this is what it looks like, right? So when you download data from the web, if you want to do social media research, there's plenty of different platforms and things to work on. Most people work on Twitter. So I blocked out the handles, but there's all of the hashtags that they're using here. This is how many people like them. There's the direct link and the time that they post, the date and time that they posted. Here's their text. This is pre-T for 2 months. This is testosterone, taking testosterone. Happy early Halloween and happy 5 weeks on testosterone for me. So there's a lot of temporality too of marking how long they're on hormones or before or after surgery, what surgeon is best. Here's my scars. I think Garamone is the best. You should check them out. And then there's a link to the actual post. So what does that look like? So I wanted to visualize what they're talking about. And one of the first things that stuck out to me is I want to know what they were talking about, right? What are they putting in the text in their posts? And so mostly what they're talking about is what they look like and how they feel. Most trans studies research is written by trans adults who have already transitioned in graduate school or sometime before that. And as a result, and I'll show you some more examples at the end, there's not a lot of what's happening when people decide that they want to take hormones or decide that they want to have surgery. So what's amazing is people tend to be on Tumblr, or tended to be on Tumblr, about 6 months or a year before deciding to have surgery or go on hormones, and then stay on about 6 months to a year after. So they're talking about the decision to do it, and they're talking about how they feel afterwards. So these are the F to M posts, a lot about time management, right? There's about how they feel about themselves, their face, what's changing about them, and about embracing and surviving life too. So if we compare that to the text and the hashtags, these are the hashtags that they're using to find one another, right? There's a lot, and they're also using to share knowledge with one another so that other people can find these things too. And you can see that there's also a kind of a sense of self and embodiment, but there's also a lot about identity, right? There's a lot of claims to different sorts of identity at different moments. Okay, so this is a word cloud, so just so you know, the bigger the word, the more often it was used, and just giving you a second to look at that before we go on. Okay, so this is actually a social network analysis graph, and I'll show you how to use it, but each of these little dots is a person, and each line between a dot is a connection. This is actually 30,000 likes in 1 month. So this is just 1 month's worth of data. I'm mostly just running month by month right now, because if I want to do anything bigger, I have to get everything set up on a server. And with COVID, I did not have time to do that before classes were over and COVID things requiring attention. So I'm going to be doing it next year. But in the meantime, each of these, there's a lot of dots you can see around the edge, right? Just single dots hanging out by themselves, or maybe like one person talking to someone else. And that's people who are not in the central conversation. They're kind of hanging out, they're lurkers, they're lookers. They might have liked one post. They don't really want you to know they're looking, or maybe it's just they have one trans friend and they liked that one post, right? They're kind of hanging out at the edge. But most of those people, when I went and looked at who they were and what they were doing, they seemed to kind of like something once a month. They were like lurking. They didn't want to get too involved in the conversation. The people in the middle, right, these different color blobs that you see are having different kinds of conversation, and they're all connected to one another, right, in some way. And in fact, when you compare 2 months, most people, so the dots with all the lines in the middle, it means that they're talking to one another. This is incredible, because if we compare these data sets, right, this is like nearly 30,000 likes on the left, 25,000 likes on the right, from 17 to 13,000 users in these 2 different months. Most people are in conversation. Most people are linking and liking back and forth to one another. Like there's a pathway where knowledge is being shared, right? And so if you've ever heard of 6 degrees of separation, which is actually true, that between us and someone in Tierra del Fuego, each of us, there is 6 degrees of separation. But it's actually less than 6 degrees of separation for these trans people using Tumblr or people supporting trans Tumblr who are 4.8 degrees of separation or 5.3. So it's less than 6 degrees of separation. It's pretty profound. So when you zoom in, this is what it looks like. Again, any of the dots is a person, and the lines are the connections between them. So when I first created this graph, I went to the Microsoft Social Media Collective, which is a really pretty advanced, awesome group of social media researchers in Boston, and I showed them this work, and I had the names on it. Because I had been teaching at Bowdoin, it was 2014. I had just made this graph the week before, and a bunch of trans students there I told them I was doing this research, and they said, "Oh, will you let us see?" And I said, "Sure." And they zoomed in, and all of the names that had been blocked out, they knew all of these accounts. They're like, "Oh, this guy," and I apologize for cursing, but I'll quote them directly. "This guy's an asshole. He's a white guy, culturally appropriative with dread. He's awful. He puts down everyone. Of course he's in the middle. He's awful. Oh, Professor Gieseking, that's gross. Of course, you know, but one of these accounts is really awesome. And this person's really supportive. And oh, I hadn't heard about this account." And it led to this conversation. And in fact, you know, what struck me was that anyone who was at that, and I would say maybe 5 years ago, 40 or younger, had been on trans Tumblr at some point in their life. I would just bring it up and they're like, yeah, I came across it at some point. And some people would spend, you know, 10 minutes. Some people would spend days or weeks on there. Some people spent like a year. But this is actually touching people's lives. And for people who were like your age at this moment, 5 years ago, they could identify all these people. They lived in this world, and there was a real community to them. And you can see that these lines also cross one another. So people are talking to all sorts of different people, you know, randomly find these hashtags and making connections. Okay, so these are, again, likes from July 2016. So what does this mean, right? So there's some cool ideas here about analyzing data, and there's some really big ones that stress me out that we're going to talk about too. They've been stressing me out for 5 years, and I finally figured out how to write about it. So the first thing is I can look at all the likes and the reblogs, and that's cool because I can show patterns of how information or knowledge changed, right? I can say what happens month to month, who's liking who, and why does that change at a certain point. Oh, God bless me, excuse me. No COVID, I'm okay, guys, just a little seasonal allergy. I have lots of really cool data to say the male-female package is not only offensive, it's violent. Something else you can look at in these images, even if you scan up right now, most of those pictures are inside, right? I don't know if you noticed this, but having looked at now tens of thousands of these images, most people take their pictures inside before they transition, and then they take their post-transition photos, usually after surgery, less with hormones, outside. Isn't that just like, it's like coming into the light, but quite literally. There's also a lot of photos you can see on the left that are alone. People are alone in the images, especially before transition. There's a lot more images where people are with other people post-transition. They'll talk about girlfriends, boyfriends, them friends beforehand, but there's a narrative to these images too. So that's something I'm thinking about. The thing I've spent the most time working on is text analysis, and because I want to understand what these trans youth are talking about, right? How are they feeling? The suicide notes, by the way, tended to disappear within a couple of years. And that's because in 2014, in the winter, a young trans woman named Leila Alcorn, if you haven't heard, this is very sad, so just as a trigger warning, did kill herself. She was from Ohio, and her parents had put her in conversion therapy, a very religious, Christian religious family, conservative family. And she came home from that, and she timed a Tumblr post to go up after she walked into a highway. And the post actually was a direct letter to President Obama asking him to end conversion therapy. And in fact, he did as a result of that letter. And people still talk and you can look up Leila Alcorn and learn about her. Her parents did bury her with her birth name and still refer to her as him. yeah, but that's something you can look up and remember Leela with me too. So in terms of text and post patterns, the suicide notes did tend to go away and people talked about crisis and needing support. I'm sure that people were continued to be suicidal. It's a common stressor as a result of gender dysphoria. Gender dysphoria being the anxiety, stress, and depression that transgender people experience as a result of living in a cisgender world. So not something that trans people bring upon themselves, but in a society that is really cis-normative, struggling to be oneself is very hard. So I was interested in psychology, medical experience. There's a vast database in this material of what happens when you go on testosterone or estrogen. I had an older trans academic colleague ask me, did anyone get breast cancer who was in your data sample? And I said, I had noticed, that people tend to be quite young. And they said, well, there's really no data on that. And I was recently diagnosed. And, if there was a data set that I knew was out there that I could access, that would be amazing, right? So what other stories have people recorded when they are fighting other illnesses or ailments? There's actually a lot about asthma that shows up in my work. And how does this change over time? The last of it is that as I was doing this research, a lot of people pointed out that I could map all these people. I think that would probably be for very creepy, and I'll talk about how and why it's creepy. I hope you think it's creepy too, but we'll talk about it. So a lot of things is to think about the sense of privacy here, right? So this data is public, but how do I protect these people, right? How do I share data, and to what end, and with whom? I have had visual recognition software experts reach out to me and say, hey, let's do something to fight against the male-female package. And I said, I don't want to use these young people's data and images to combat that. Also, who these most people do not know who is using their data, especially if you created a blog when you were 15. If you want to go back and see if your Tumblr is still there, y'all, your Tumblr is still there. I have taught grad students who freaked out in the middle of my class to go back and find their MySpace and their Tumblr still in existence. So, and who's using it? And how do we deal with youth judging one another and also supporting one another, competing with one another? How are they changing knowledge on a daily basis? Because there are, right? And they're passing on knowledge. And this is really mind-blowing, right? Because if you think about when I showed you the Usenet archive, that old school click, and so few people could get to that, you have to think about, you have to computer access, you have to have money, education. These are mostly white people who have access to these resources to be able to do this in the 80s. And again, we're mostly seeing people who pass as white and these faces that are shaping this knowledge. And then knowledge and language and ideas and is accruing, right? Accumulating in small measures over time, right? But at the same time, there are always new young people getting on having the same argument. I mean, if you ever said that's so high school, they're having that's so high school over and over again, because most of them are about that. They created the words, I think, I'm pretty sure, I haven't been able to find uses earlier, but if you've never heard of too cute versus true scum is people who think there are very absolute boundaries on how you're trans, and too cute are, you're trans just because you identify as that, and that's beautiful. So there's different language and ideas being built. So one thing I decided to do is I worked with my buddy Crystal Hall, who teaches up at Bowdoin. And I said, we have, this huge, massive data set, and out of the top 50 used words, the words top surgery, binder, and binding appeared. So if you don't know about this, if you're born with boobs and you don't like them, some people put a binder around them and they squish them down. I can't see your faces for you to be like, gosh, of course we know this, Professor Gieseking. So I'm telling you the whole thing. And maybe there's someone who doesn't know, so it's good to share. So the binder is the object that goes around, and the binding is the verb, the act of doing that. So if you look down here where these green dots are in the bottom middle, My mouse has disappeared, so I can't show you this. But the green dots down the middle, there's very few uses of the word binding. People are actually more so talking about the binder. So what's the difference? So I went back and checked. Well, people are saying, what kind of binder do you use? They're asking each other for tips. They don't need to know how to put it on. They need to know what to buy. Like, this ACE bandage actually doesn't cut it. What are you all doing, right? And they're sharing knowledge in that way. And then there's the people talking about top surgery. And you can see in the middle that the orange and the green and the purple are a little bit overlapping, but for the most set, it's two different worlds. So we have this pre-surgery conversation that people are binding or deciding not to have surgery, and then a post-surgery conversation, right? And very little of the conversation is actually happening together. That's pretty profound. So it was going back through Trans Studies Quarterly, which is the leading trans studies journal, and there were 10,000 hashtags, and this is just in 1 month, by the way. This is just 1 month of data. That previous image was 1 month of data. So 10,000 people used the word surgery in some way in their hashtag, and 83% of those posts talked about top surgery. This is in the F to M data set, and just 8% talked about bottom surgery, and that is using different parts of the labia to build a small and functioning, limited functioning penis for someone who would like to have that. It's a less popular surgery. It usually takes 4 or 6 tries for it to fully work. It's a lot of dedication. It's quite painful, versus top surgery, which is actually quite common and you heal from in a couple of months for the most part, right? So comparing this to something like Trans Studies Quarterly, where it is writing all these literatures, 30% of their articles talk about surgery, but only 3% of them mention top surgery, 5% mention bottom surgery, right? And they're talking about different sorts of things. So my research about trans Tumblr and everyday trans life is adding something different to think about what Trans Studies is doing, which is mostly talking from archival research, individual interviews, personal experience, to think about this big data set that's sitting out there, which has definite benefits to being used and definite worries too. So here's that image again. So where does this leave us, the trans tipping point, where does this leave us with big data? Because you've heard about big data, you should care, should you care? Okay. Maybe the better thing you should be asking is, should we analyze all data? And what are the ethics of data analysis for the marginalized? And they're very different. As much as I don't want data to be analyzed, this data is being analyzed. This data, the people are crawling the web for any data set they can get and analyzing it and turning it into something they can sell or some way to market to people. And so for me, I think I've written a lot about this, about how we can, and papers I'm still working on, about how we should speak back about this. This is something I'm really concerned about. I want to go back to the geography point. This is Miss Lady. It's my cat. She is really cute. This is when she used to live in Northampton. She's taken some photos of herself and doesn't realize that she's geolocated herself in Northampton. And if you didn't know, every time, when you turn on, if you take a picture and it says, I'm in Williamstown, I'm in New York, I'm in Mumbai, it's reporting that back to Apple, right? And it actually has the exact latitude and longitude at which you took that image. So this is from an Apple computer. If you hit Command I, or you right click and show details on an image with a PC, you can actually get the latitude and longitude of the image that you took it in. So this means that all of those trans youth that I have pictures of, right, and I've shown you, people pointed out to me very early when I was doing my research that I could grab all the images, I could download them, right? I hadn't done that yet. I thought that was creepy, to say the least. And that I could run a very easy to write Python script, so easy I could write it, and grab all of the latitude and longitudes out of those images. And that means that all those people we saw taking pictures of themselves in their bathroom, I can map them all to their parents' bathroom. Now, to me, this is so gross, right? This is so evil. But there's also, what about if I grab all the data and I mask it by region? or by area, not by county whatsoever. We could get one trans person in a county, you probably guess who it is in some really rural areas. But you can mass the data and then say, on average, the distance to an LGBT center is this number of miles, right? People tend to spend more time online when they can't get access to resources in real life, right? I could prove those sorts of things. People who have the most questions, who come online looking for more information from Trans Tumblr, also didn't live anywhere near a trans gender affirming physician. So that sort of data is amazing, but it requires being a researcher who's carefully masking data, cleaning it, organizing it, and deciding what can be revealed and how. So what about this trans era of big data? What does it make us think about trans theory? So what about the data, right? I want to just go through this idea of big data really fast, right? And as an ending to kind of give you an idea to think about trans studies, like what is trans studies and what is trans theory? Because I'm sure you're talking about what is feminist theory and what is queer theory and how is trans theory different. So there's this guy, Donald Winnicott. He's a really cool psychoanalyst. And everyone was talking about the good mother and the bad mother back in the mid 20th century. He's like, no, no, no. You don't have to be perfect. You just have to be good enough. You know, your kid just has to survive. And that's great, good mothering, right? And, you know, you can't always be there, you can't always be perfect. And this enoughness really hit me because there's no perfect data, there's no total data, right? When we think about big data, there's this expectation that we can get all of the data, right? And there's an assumption that size really matters. What could that have to do with? I have no idea. I'm sure Sigmund could help us, right? But trying to think about trans theory and big data actually really helps us when we put it together, right? To think about big enough data, right? So let me show you, right? So this is, here, these things, have you seen these things before? Here's feminism, right? Personal is political, right? Political is personal. Binaries, we don't like them, not gonna keep them. Standpoint epistemologies, you speak from your own experience, awesome, right? Then comes queer theory, right? We're gonna get rid of exclusions. We're against reductionism, right? We're gonna focus on desire. The ethics of Eros is like, we're gonna highlight desire. We're not gonna push out sex and sexuality out of that, right? And these theories are also building on anti-racist theories, Black radical tradition, and this is not accounting for the complexity of this. Is very trying to keep it tight for you. But then the trans theories that come in, like where does that help, right? So one thing about trans theory that I think is really interesting from my data is that it holds the binaries and multiples in tension, right? That even though these kids have these arguments over and over again about who is trans enough, they keep trying to reproduce a hierarchy of scale and then fighting each other and stopping it. So that's pretty powerful, right? And another thing is everything is always partial and situated, right? Even if you have a standpoint epistemology from feminism, there's a realization, I think in trans thinking, as these views show, that you're only this person in this moment. You only have this experience in this moment. And even when people go back and look at their Tumblr blogs, they're a bit shocked that that's what they said at a certain time, right? So the other one is to think about from a social science perspective, about doing really careful, long-term, incremental analysis, because if we don't, we're thinking about people in these very situated moments, these partial moments, and creating these claims about bigger ideas about trans life and experience aren't as fair as they could be unless we do this long-term work, right? And then also, who gets to accumulate knowledge, and who refuses to be ignored by mainstream ways that capitalism decides who gets to record what, right? If you think about Wikipedia, there's a lot of Wikipedia pages that are locked down and shut down because so many people have fought over them over time. And if you've never seen it, John F. Kennedy is one of them, right? Palestine, Israel, State of Israel is one. And who gets to make knowledge, right? How does the internet work? Like, what does Google push to the top that you think, how many times do you really look for it past the first page? you should know academics don't either. Like most like really smart researchers, the chances of them going past the third page is a freaking miracle. So who gets to define knowledge and who gets to fight against it? So I added these 3 points as ideas for us to build from. One is to the manifold can be held in tension. And this is definitely something you see in trans studies today. Thinking about the lived realities of life and kind of to recognize all the difference, and thinking about queer, trans, feminist data studies. So that's what I've been thinking about and working on. I hope this gave you some insight into what's happening with trans life. And I think we're getting back to the crazy but tiny metaphor that I love opening with the L word. Yeah, there it is. It's all crazy, but it's not tiny. Yeah. Okay, so thank you. If you would like to read or see any of this, I put all of my work online on my website, and I will stop sharing my screen so I can finally, oh, thank God, there you are again. I was just talking to myself the whole time. Thank you.
Wonderful. Oh my goodness. Thank you. Let's first give a round of applause. I know, or you can click on your icon for clapping if you prefer.
Thanks. I appreciate it. That's cool. Real people. Real people.
Ways to participate. Thank you so much, Jack, Dr. Gieseking. We have about maybe 17 or 18 minutes for Q&A, which is...
Sorry, I talked so long. I was like trying to get in every definition that ever existed. I realized.
No, this is an incredible resource for us. So I think what I will do is I'm going to open the participants list, and then I will just open it up to questions. And if people could raise their hand in Zoom. So I think hopefully most folks know how to do this, but I think if you go down to the lower right-hand corner of your screen, you can click on the little button that says raise hand. If you're not able to do that, you can also send me a message in the chat and I'll call on you. But Dr. Gieseking has given us so much to think about in terms of trans and queer and feminist research methods and ethics. Why do you need to know the history of trans activism to understand what's going on in social media now? And what the heck is trans geographies or feminist geographies? So, so it's just a couple starting places, but let me open it up to see who would like to start us off with a question. Anyone brave to go first? Okay, well, I will get us warmed up. A lot of your work is happening.
I just want to say, you can ask me anything. I mean, obviously, I'll say anything. You've seen me talk about all this stuff. So just, whatever you want to know about or wasn't clear about, or you want to learn more about, or what the cool kids are reading in trans studies, or, what they're thinking about. I'd love to talk about that. So yeah, please go on.
Yeah, anybody want to get us started? Yes, Nicole.
Awesome. Thank you so much for speaking with us today. That was really informative and valuable. I really appreciated it. I wanted to get back to your question of, should all data be analyzed? What are the ethics of data analysis of the marginalized? We've talked a little bit about this. Also sort of about what the value of sort of lived experience versus sort of this type of data, big data you're talking about. So if you could speak about that as well, really appreciate it. Thank you.
Yeah, totally. I think that there's a really great guy, Oliver Hameson, who does all the, do you remember when Facebook suddenly had 50 gender options? Yeah, that was, Oliver was heavily involved, right? Like Oliver goes to Facebook and yells at them and then changes things. And there's a woman named Kiashana Gray, who's this Black queer brilliant woman who yells at Xbox, and they change all their racist policies step by step. So there are academics out there who do this kind of work. I think that there's like such a gap between the idealization of big data and lived experience, because data are just phenomena we decide to capture, right? Because I showed you that spreadsheet, and there's other things that they could capture. They could capture where you are. They could ask you to put in a location. They could, ask for like how you're feeling that day. Whatever they want, they can ask for, and they can decide to capture. They can capture our keystrokes, right? Like as we're online and we're on a Google page, it's capturing how we move our mouse. And how we click, like we're that identifiable, right? That's like a pattern. So I think that it reduces us to someone we aren't. It reduces us to these patterns and versions of ourselves, and then it kind of sells us those patterns and reproduces them, and then we don't break out and innovate. So down with the device, personally, is my take, Nicole, I would tell you. And I also think, you know, like I have not really written much about it in 6 years because I just keep hoping someone else will. You know, it's not the happiest data set to sit and work with. And it's also like, I don't get to talk to them. I'd love talking, obviously. And yeah, it's a bummer not to hear, like, is this really what your story is? Is this what happened to you? And how do you feel about it? And so my long-term goal is to make all the data visualizations and then take it to trans youth groups and have them analyze it with me. You know, what do they want to know? And what do they want to see? Because finding the people in the research I could try, but I don't know, you know, in the data.
Makes a lot of sense. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
Okay, who else has a question? I have Kim.
Hi, yeah, thank you so much. I'm just wondering, you were talking a little bit about how the like NSFW laws kind of shut down the transgender community. And I was wondering, because the community seems really important, like what happened, like where did it go?
Kim, it's all about nipples. So, you know, a male nipple, it's okay to put a male nipple on the internet. Did you know this, right? Did you notice? You can see a guy without his shirt on the internet. That's okay. But you can't see a lady without her shirt on. And then when it comes to the male-female recognition package, they're just, you know, slim shot identifying all sorts of people as all sorts of genders and just, well, let's just delete it all. Let's delete it all. So like you have all these great surgery photos from back in the day where people would be like, hey, look at my top surgery. And you would see the scars and they're like nipple, gender, delete, just in case, right? So all of this mass archive, a lot of it's been deleted. There was a lot of sex in there. I gave you a nice screenshot. It was a polite screenshot. And so any kind of, all the good stuff got deleted, right? And that was a bummer. And then I've been showing you the F to M, but how M to Fs, trans women are so sexualized, especially trans Black and brown women. So you would look at also F to M, by the way, stands for first time mother. So really hilarious images in the middle of my trans male data collection. Yeah, always just one eager little lady with her baby. But the M to F data, you would have a lot of people hypersexualizing trans women, and there would be pornography in the middle of information sharing about knowledge and hormones. That just got eliminated, and the reaction to it was, well, we're not going to stay here. Right. And so I think the Finsta really became, y'all know, fake, just in case, okay, fake, okay, oh, yes, the oldest people are not shaking their heads, good, not them. So they're fake, you all should teach them about Finstas. Teach your faculty. So Finstas are fake Instagram accounts, but they're really real. And they're usually the accounts you're most real with somebody else in, or you have just like meme threads, but they're private and nobody knows, and only your friends usually know. It's like a tight group. And so a lot of trans youth that all of my grad students are talking to are all on different kinds of Instagram, or they'll be on Kik where it can be anonymous, or they'll be sharing certain kind of threads on Snapchat. But yeah, TikTok is its own beast. But yeah, this kind of community is gone. But a lot of people feel they can join other sorts of chat groups. There's more kind of institutional support. But I think it's a huge loss too, to be able to have that like privacy in public where you can just share anything.
Great, thanks so much. All right, others. And you can also raise your hand, and it just sort of it puts you in a line to ask a question. So feel free to raise your hand and I'll call you in order. Okay, well, we're waiting for folks to line up, so to speak. I'm curious, just in thinking about your last question, Jack, about how, you know, COVID has pushed so many of us inside and pushed many of us, I think, into kind of more embedded kinds of relationship with people online, right? So have you seen it all in your early data of the COVID months, how that's changed, if at all, people's uses of these kind of spaces, or are there new kind of spaces? Yeah.
I think there are more. So I was just talking to a Vox journalist about this, And she's a trans woman, and she was saying she was seeing a real rise in secret Twitter, private Twitter, anonymous Twitter accounts. And that there's all these kids who didn't get to go to college this year. And I think about them all the time. And all the kids who would have met, oh God, had a crush they didn't even realize they were about to have, or had some freaking, oh God, it's heartbreaking to think like all of this queerness and transness that's trapped at home with parents. What a it's awful. Like in some ways it's evil, and in some ways it's just a bummer for some people, but some people it's okay. But for a lot of people it's not. And that's really scary. And I think that they're finding different ways of reaching out and creating conversations. And Twitter is like screaming into the, you can get responses on Twitter, but it's like that's a big platform to jump to. There's also a study I've seen, someone told me about it. I haven't been able to find it or figure out who told me about it. But it was about the socialization of gender, about where to ask for help. So if you had a problem, think about in your head, where would you go ask for help? Like what platform, if you were like, how does this work? What should I do? What should I buy? So the study found that people assigned male at birth tend to go to Reddit, and people assigned women at birth tend to go to Facebook. So you're asking anonymously, or you're asking your friends. And that's what's in there. And so a lot of information about trans women is on Reddit. Right? A lot of that knowledge went to Reddit. And then when it comes to trans men, there are a lot of private groups on Facebook, but I think more Instagram even too, that people are sharing notes and ideas on Instagram.
Interesting. Yeah, it makes us think so much about that shift in public and private space. Yeah. I'm going to call on Trudy, who is lined up next.
Hi, thank you so much. This was amazing. I was just wondering, because I've heard about sort of how I guess algorithms give you posts and things that you that are related to what you've been clicking on before, and so a lot of the connections in the graphs you showed might be sort of, like obviously people are trying to connect with each other, but also sort of constructed by algorithms. And I was wondering if you had any thoughts also about like the way that other people outside of the community wouldn't see as much, and whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, or neither.
Those are dope questions. There's an awesome book called Algorithms of Oppression by Sophia Noble, which if you haven't seen, you can like, it's like undergrad reading a couple days and go, and super great, brilliant book. And there's also The Filter Bubble, which is an older book, but still highly legible. Yeah, and our algorithms are feeding us the same thing. You can Google right now, what does Google know about me? And they're going to tell you what age they think you are. They're going to tell you what gender. You should look, see what gender Google thinks you are. They'll tell you. Google it, guys. I don't care if you're doing that while I'm listening. I'm yammering. I'll listen to myself. Look it up. And it doesn't know what gender I am still, and I love that. I'm super chuffed, but maybe it knows I don't want to be known. So it knows my age. It's true. Because you're a certain age, you look at a certain thing. I think the most famous example, of course, is at Target, like based on, I think, 17 different items, they figured out if you're pregnant and what month of your pregnancy you're in. And they like the famous case where they told a 16-year-old got ads for this, and the father went in and said, "How dare you send this to my daughter?" And actually they had, by an algorithm, figured out that this girl was pregnant before, and she knew she was buying the vitamins and the Oreos. There's some sort of chocolate and some sort of lotion and things. I don't know. I've never been pregnant. So that are bought in different orders. But they can tell a lot about us. Yeah. So they can tell when we're pregnant before we tell other people. I think that Tumblr has never had as many algorithms as part of it to it was showing you the most recent posts at all times. And Tumblr was also independently owned for a really long time during my research. So it wasn't like latched onto this, must give you more algorithms. But I'm sure you remember when Instagram kept showing you just used to be able to see what recently happened, and then it switched everything around, and it's so annoying. And you can't see everything in order anymore, and you don't have the option to opt out. I think that the algorithms, are greatly skewing any sort of research now, like wildly significantly more than what we knew before. And I think that overall they're pretty bad, because they definitely have led us to this very bifurcated United States of America in this very extreme political election moment, and these like very needed the root revolution of Black Lives Matter, and how people are hearing two sides of the story. They're just so extreme and then not talking. And yeah, so algorithm, I'm usually not a fan of them. I would say that most social media studies scholar find algorithms to be, how they're used and how they're deployed, very limiting to how we live our lives. I don't know. I think that they're influencing Instagram a lot. I think there's a lot of kids who get on Instagram and they think they're seeing everything and they're not. And I think that really sucks. Yeah, but less so other places.
Great. Who else have a question?
Facebook.
We have time for a couple more, I think. Maybe everyone's actively Googling themselves.
Yeah, did you find out? Are you the right age? Did it find out your gender? What do you think? Is it right? Anybody?
Post your results in the chat.
Yeah, please.
Just asked, what does Google know about me? And all I got was a bunch of links to websites that were going to tell me about that, which I suspect are then going to like steal.
No, it's an ad. It's a story that got reprinted a lot. So if you pick one like Vox or something that's like a trusted news source, it'll actually give you the link through to Google.
Oh,
Google doesn't quite advertise it.
my age is really showing.
Okay.
Okay, Jack runs girls love around us all in terms of the tech stuff anyway. What we have time for maybe one or two more questions. Anybody want to ask about a different social media platform and they're curious to know how it's being used? Jack, what should we be reading in trans studies right now? What's exciting?
Wait, I brought down my favorite book, y'all. It's $10. You can also read it on the internet for free. It's called Trans Care. It's the sweetest, most beautiful balm. And if you know a trans person, you should get this for them for the holidays. I'm going to buy them in bulk and send them to my friends. It is the sweetest, nicest thing. And it's so freaking smart. You're like, whoa, how did I never think about that? Yeah, Trans Care. It's online for free on a website called Manifold. Speaking of manifolds. But if you want to read that, that's incredibly, I heard you read Kai Green because you have Kai Green in your department. How cool are you? I love Trevor Ellison's work.
We're really read for this week, yeah.
Yeah. Oh, isn't that convenient? Shout out the geographers. Petra Doan I'll just tell you, the geographers has been writing for a really long time, and you might read it and be really like, how dare she say transgenderist? Well, she was like there when they created that word, so she can say that, and she wrote that article a long time ago and just realized things have changed. But there's also the journal Trans Studies Quarterly, and that's really humanities driven. So if you're more interested in social science research, yeah, Oliver Hameson, really amazing. Anna Lauren Hoffman, we're writing a reply to, there's a new book out called Data Feminism that talks about big dick data. It's an actual technical term I'm allowed to say to you. And I love that. And yeah, so she and I are gonna write a reply to that and some social media journal she's picking. So yeah, Data Feminism.
Just post a couple of those in the chat.
Yeah. Data Feminism also has lots of cool, smart ideas, and you will learn a lot about what's happening in the world. It's very smart and super easy. Also free online.
And I'm just going to put the title of Professor Gieseking's book here again, A Queer New York, as a last minute plug for that. And
that'll be free online soon too. Just wait. You don't need to find.
Lots of good for those who are interested in learning more about trans and queer and dyke histories, and maybe about geography as well. For some of you, this might be your first introduction to the ways that geography can be used in feminist studies. And then I think, let me just check and see if there are any more hands up. I don't think so. Okay, so last thing, we're all sort of trying to fill our whatever free time we have, right, with finding new shows. Is there anything new on TV or Netflix or HBO or whatever that that you're excited about the way it's representing trans lives?
Oh, I was just going to say Lucifer, which I don't even think has a trans character in it, but my God, that week of my life with just absolute fluff and joy. God, I have not watched Disclosure yet. I think that it will be, I think it's really important to see Disclosure. It's a documentary about like how trans, gender nonconforming, gender non-binary people appear in film. And every trans person I know who watched it said they couldn't talk for a couple of days after, which is kind of like seeing Boys Don't Cry. So yeah, and the precursor to Disclosure is called The Celluloid Closet, which is the history of representation of gay and lesbians and in the way trans people. That's on Amazon. And really important. I don't think it's on Prime, but it cycles in and out of Prime. But incredibly important movie. I always teach with it. Yeah, disclosure, I would say, is where it's at.
Great. Well, thank you so much again. We are just so, yes.
If you have questions you didn't want to ask me in public, you can DM me on Twitter. Okay, yes, or email me.
Yes, and there's also space in the chat here. Folks can get in touch. I will post this lecture on Glow after class, so if you want to go back and look through any of those great maps or kind of study the slides, you can do that. Thank you again, Professor Gieseking. Jack, it's such a pleasure.
This is cool. There's an alum that I went to Germany with on a fellowship once who never stopped talking about how great Williams was. Well, I never shut up about Mount Holyoke, so I will tell her I got to lecture at Williams. She is as obsessed as I am about Mount Holyoke. So lovely to meet you all. Yeah, and email with any questions or anything you have. I'd be happy to talk.
Sounds great. You can find Dr. Jack Gieseking online, the University of Kentucky, or on his personal website, which maybe you can post the link in the chat there, which also has links to some of the incredible projects that Jack's been involved with in mapping and thinking about histories of feminist geographies. So, and there's that link. Great.
If you want to know about the history of gay monuments in the U.S., I help with that too. That's fun too. If you want to talk about preservation, just the most fun thing to discuss, but it's cool when you go to see them.
So maybe we can all unmute our microphones one last time and give a warm round of applause.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you again. We'll see you all soon.
Be well.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Your students are so cool.
They're great. I'm going to end this and then we can talk.